We learnt in part one of this three-part series that based on compelling evidence, the Gospels are very unlikely to be later products of mythology or legend. If you missed this part one, please look at the above link. But we're all aware of how, unfortunately, some scrupulous journalists may sometimes exaggerate, mislead, or just make things up when it comes to new news. So, are the original New Testament Gospel accounts just unreliable fake news made up at the time of events? And are the original New Testament Gospels and letters a reliable account of the actual events? The consensus of all scholars is that Jesus died in either AD 30 or 33. Scholars also generally agree that Paul was writing within 20 years of Jesus' death, extending from around AD 40 to AD 60. Dr. Shaw summarises that most current scholars believe that Mark was the first Gospel, written somewhere between AD 65 and 70, followed by Matthew and Luke around AD 80 to 85, with John finishing in AD 95. Importantly, all this was within the lifetime of the first generation eyewitnesses and within 65 years of Jesus' death. Of the 13 letters taken as written by Paul, even the most critical scholars agree that at least 7 of these were written by Paul. So who wrote the Gospels? The 4 Gospels are all anonymous in the text itself. However, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are uniformly associated with the 4 Gospels bearing their names. So who were the 4 Gospel biographers? Shaw states that Matthew and John were eyewitnesses of Jesus. Mark is believed to have been a scribe for Peter, and Luke a travelling companion of Paul. Mark and Luke were associated with Matthew and John, and all lived at the time and of the first generation followers of the way. Professor Balcom, cited in Shaw, states no evidence exists that these Gospels were ever known by other names. Several scholars have argued that the authors were intended to be known and not originally anonymous. But this anonymity is not uncommon for the time. Several other ancient authors didn't write their names in the text, but were functionally known as the authors. For example, Irenaeus, writing around AD 180, refers to all 4 Gospel names. Additionally, the Roman senator and historian Tacitus, AD 57 to 117, also didn't write his name down as author. Professor Gathercole, cited in Shaw, asserts that there are 16 very early ancient sources that refer to one or more of the Gospel names. Even today, many papers, books, and articles today do not have the author in the body of the text, but we know who the authors were. Shaw also refers to the issue of practicality. As each Gospel was written and distributed, there would have been a need to differentiate between each of the 4 Gospel copies in a library. Gathercole states, the author's name would be attached to the outside of the scroll or on an attached label. If they had intended to be anonymous, we would expect a multiple number of names to be attached to the 4 Gospels. Again, which we have zero evidence for. What other evidence do we have for the reliability of the Gospels? When it comes to the reliability of the Gospel authors as early and reliable accounts of the teachings and events of Jesus, and not just later invented works of fiction, J. Wallace takes a slightly different and novel, but nonetheless important, forensic approach. Interestingly, Wallace started his investigation as a doubting, skeptical atheist. He approaches the question of reliability in much the same way as investigating a modern crime scene, using many of the tools he would have used in his role as a crime investigator of yet unsolved or so-called cold case crimes. How do we know that the Gospel of Mark was written first? Well, one of the many pieces of evidence for Mark written first of the four is offered from Wallace's experience of interviewing crime scene witnesses. In his book, Wallace concludes that the Gospel of Mark bears many indications of being an early broadcast of crime scene events, similar to that what he had experienced in many of his crime investigations. But what about the slightly different accounts of events given in the Gospels? Wallace goes on to add that true, reliable eyewitness accounts are never completely parallel and identical. Wallace goes on to state that we should expect variations among eyewitness accounts. This is exactly what we see within the four Gospel accounts. Wallace bases his investigation on four tests and whether the four Gospels pass these four tests. These tests are: were the authors present? Are they corroborated? Are they accurate? And the last one, are they biased? Test 1. Were they present? I refer you to the detailed book study in the link description. But in summary, Wallace looks in detail at the evidence statements of the four Gospels, treating them as he would have evaluated eyewitness accounts to a modern crime many years later after the event, i.e. a cold case. Based on the most reliable inference from the evidence, there is evidence of an early date of authorship and confirms the Gospel writers were actually present to see what they claim to have written about. Test 2. Can the Gospel account authors be corroborated? The Gospel writers referenced names correctly, used appropriate language for the time, and identified correct locations. Also, non-biblical evidence also corroborates the writers, as well as subsequent archaeology. More of this topic in part 3. Test 3. But are they accurate? John, Peter and Paul had second generation students. Professor McDowell states that Clement of Rome, AD 95, and Ignatius, AD 70 to 1110, and Polycarp, AD 70 to around 156, all had direct student relationships with one or more of the first generation witnesses, John, Peter or Paul. Tertullian, cited in McDowell, states that Peter appointed Clement. Additionally, Ignatius states that Clement had the preaching of the apostles still echoing in his ears. Second generation followers of Jesus, like Clement, Ignatius and Polycarp, are an important link in the chain of custody back to the original New Testament. Given that the written evidential records of second generation students Ignatius, Clement of Rome and Polycarp, and their direct student connection with at least John, Paul and Peter, this is more evidence for the accuracy of the Gospels as reliable eyewitness accounts. Test 4 on the last test. Are they biased? There's no evidence that the apostles were driven by financial gain, lust, or the pursuit of power. So the most reasonable conclusion given by Wallace is that the writers of the New Testament are reliable eyewitness accounts. In concluding this part 2, we explore 3 pieces of compelling evidence that the Gospels were written very early on, after and close to the events of Jesus, and within the first eyewitnesses' lifespans. Several early second generation authors, many of whom personally knew and were students of the first generation apostles, also corroborate with the message and teachings recorded in the New Testament. The eyewitness gospel accounts show many verifiable hallmarks of a truthful and reliable eyewitness to the events they testify about. Again, whilst these aspects in this part 2 are compelling pieces of evidence for the reliability of the New Testament, there are more unconnected pieces of evidence that we haven't yet discussed. These cover the written texts themselves and external archaeological discoveries. These two final aspects of evidence for the reliability of the New Testament is for our next video in part 3. So again, please consider subscribing to this channel to keep updated as to when these new videos and new topics are released. Thank you.